book, I think you quote Mendelssohn saying that the music that's really important to him, it's not that it's insufficiently specific to be communicated in words, but it's too specific to be communicated in words. To what extent do you think that's also true of visual images?
What I think is so brilliant about that observation is that beholding a work of art brings into being an experience which is actually unique. Listening to a certain piece of music, our language for our reactions is very dull, blunt and general. Makes me feel sad, makes me feel happy, almost ridiculous, because the actual feelings associated with a certain piece of music are quite specific to that piece of music and very hard to imagine them being evoked anywhere else. So what it alerts us to is that when the left hemisphere is analysing how a work of art has its effect on us, it tends to generalise, makes the unique very general, makes the specific generic. And the real beauty of any great work of art, be that a successful poem, a great painting or a great piece of music, is that it gives us an experience that we couldn't have found anywhere else. In other words, if it hadn't existed, there would be a hole in the cosmos, the shape of that great work.
I'd love to turn the conversation to relate to the work that I do in the laboratory at Oxford, where we study small stuff, nanomaterials, and particularly how we can control and understand individual quantum states in them. And in a book called It Keeps Me Seeking, the three of us describe how we find that the material world, the kind of things that I study in the laboratory, seems to call us out to something beyond itself. Mm-hmm. How does that, for me, very intense experience, how is that illuminated by our understandings of the relative contributions of the two hemispheres?
I think it's a lovely way to begin thinking about those differences. One of the things we've been talking about is works of art, but in a sense they sound very rarefied things, but in a way they are particularly acute cases of the whole of our experience of the material world, in that it is not just matter. Materialists, I always say, are not people who overvalue matter, but who undervalue matter, because matter is the means whereby we come to other kinds of experience. It's through our bodies, through our senses, that we come to find other experiences embodied in what we call the material world, but which is never separate from the spiritual realm. I think of us as amphibious creatures that live in the realm of matter and the realm of spirit at the same time. And what's happened in the thinking of the last 3 centuries is that we've closed down to a very large extent the idea of human experience as having a spiritual dimension, and instead focused on it as being merely understandable in terms of matter. Of course, once you start saying that matter can have certain extraordinary properties, that a purely material, chaotic universe can produce Bach's St. Matthew Passion, you've said that matter must be some very, very remarkable stuff, and therefore that the reduction no longer works. As soon as you see going upwards that matter can come to make things with such colossal beauty, complexity and meaning, then there can be no such thing as mere matter.
It's a question worth asking, isn't it? What properties must the universe have that part of itself can begin to understand the whole?
Yes, yes. Well, it must be there from the beginning, in my view. In The Matter with Things, I argue that consciousness is an ontological primitive. In other words, it can't be made to emanate from or originate in anything else that we know. It is one of the ultimate building blocks of the cosmos. And that's not nowadays a particularly unusual idea. It's endorsed by Colin Blakemore and V.S. Ramachandran in their Oxford book on science. And I think that this is now becoming a much more general idea. It goes with the rise of the idea of panpsychism.
How do the two hemispheres of the brain help us to understand that? Because consciousness is simultaneously, as you say, basic to our experience as humans, and at the same time extremely elusive when we try to pin it down objectively and describe it and evaluate it and so on. Whereas the material world, at least in our present culture, we find rather sort of easier to get to grips with, you know, particularly with the spectacular success of the scientific methods in beginning to account for the material world.
Yes, but as you, of course, know as a physicist, the sort of folksy idea that, well, at least we understand matter, so if you can just reduce all these other things that seem spiritual and not material to the material, then we will have understood them. And it's a very good principle in science that if you can make something you don't understand understandable in terms of something that you do, then that is a reasonable way forward. The problem is that we don't have the foggiest idea what matter is. Matter is just as mysterious as consciousness. And indeed, I believe that they are not wholly separate from one another, that consciousness permeates the material universe. And that matter is, if I can use such an expression, a phase of consciousness, in the sense that ice and steam are phases of water. They have completely different characteristics. They look and are experienced entirely differently, but they are actually all water in one form or another. And I see matter as the embodiment of necessary resistance in the universe. The universe is a creative space. Everything in it is constantly ramifying and producing new individual things. And for anything to come into being requires a degree of resistance, and it's matter that provides that degree of resistance, that degree of permanence in the flow that is required to be balanced with the flow.
At one point in The Master and His Emissary, you make the observation that you know, our knowledge of things is always affected by our interaction with the things,
Yes.
and ask the question, you know, whether that means that there's never going to be any kind of absolute truthful description of something. And this, as well as being, I think, a common experience, has a particular mathematical precision when it comes to the quantum world, where we can state with great mathematical accuracy the way in which what we observe depends on the way that we choose to observe it.
This is a wonderful and fascinating finding, isn't it? And suggests that there are not necessarily ways in which everything can be reduced to the externally observable. Many things that we know are, if we have experienced them, very real, such as love, cannot be measured. It cannot be put on a table in a lab, and nobody can estimate its size. And so we know that there are many real things that are like this. When you say that consciousness is something that we find very difficult to grasp, in a way it depends what we mean by grasp. To grasp it from the outside is very difficult, but consciousness is the one thing of which we have 100% certainty, because I couldn't even say this without having consciousness. You couldn't understand it without having consciousness. We know that we understand matter and experience matter through our consciousness, but we don't know that we understand and experience consciousness through the material brain. That is possible, and it's a very reasonable hypothesis, but it isn't certain. And I myself hold that while in this world our consciousness is mediated in some way by the brain, it is not actually originated in the brain.
This is a sort of question that I found myself facing as we've developed machine learning for running the experiments in the lab. And you know, which aspects of human experience and brain activities can we develop machines to learn how to do? Which ones will be forever beyond their grasp? It seems to me that this relationship between these may I for a moment call them transcendent realities, and the material world is one that's inseparable. That is to say, you know, the sort of words that you've been using, like love and so on. You can't love people without involving the material world, whether you cook them a meal or give them a birthday present. You know, it's or provide a house or nurture your children while they're growing up and so on. It's all going to be mediated through material means. I think what most of us long for is that the material means should have some significance beyond the material. And if we go back to the world of making images and art and so on, again, the painter is expressing something that may be too specific for words, but the painter is going to use material means to turn that into the reality that can be enjoyed by by others.
Yes, well, I think you're demonstrating very well this coming together of the ethereal and spiritual with the material. And that's not an unusual thought. After all, the central image and the great strength, it seems to me, of Christianity as a religion is that it has at its core this idea that God is incarnated in the world. And other religions, other spiritual traditions than Christianity also embody this idea that the material world is shot through with spiritual meaning, and that the two are not in any way at war with one another, but rather, in fact, further one another's means and possibilities.
I think that's right. If you take John's articulation of it, kai ho logos sarx egenitor, you know, the word became materially embodied.
Yes, yes.
In a way that was necessarily specific in space and time.
Yes.
And in a way that means that events that happened in space and time have a significance that transcends beyond those who immediately encountered them there and then.
Indeed, and what's lovely is this idea of that's embodied in the Greek word egenito that you mentioned, that what happens is a becoming. The word became, but it's translated as in this idea of the word was made flesh, verbum factum est, and so this is the idea in Latin, or the translation from the Latin Vulgate gives us the idea that this was a once and for all fact, whereas in fact it is a continuing, never ceasing process. I believe that all that we see, including the material world, is in fact process. In that sense, I am a follower of Iain Whitehead, that what we think of as things are actually becoming, as constantly flowing and constantly becoming more of what they are.
Well, that's certainly true of human experience. We did some experiments in the lab, which well, they were published in Physical Review X a year ago, and this had the fourth highest hits of any article that's ever appeared in this rather technical Physics International Journal. And the particular thing we showed in the lab was that if you want to measure the passage of time, in other words, a clock, the more accurately you want to measure time, the greater is the entropic cost. So the waste heat that comes out of it. And this is quite important for technologies and for quantum technologies. But it also, for me, illuminates this greater experience that we have as humans of before and after. That is to say, in almost all of physics, whether it's Newton's laws or Maxwell's equations or Schrödinger's equation or general relativity, there is no before and after. There is no arrow of time in any of the equations. And the only exception to that in the whole of physics is heat. And it's articulated in the second law of thermodynamics, which says that entropy increases, so that gives you an arrow of time. And one of the people who wrote a lot about this was Sir Arthur Eddington, and he asked whether there was something specific about human consciousness that gave you this sense of an arrow of time, which is, you know, for all the fact that it doesn't appear in most of physics, it appears in all of our lives. You know, babies are born, parents die. You squeeze the toothpaste out of the tube and you can't easily get it back in again. and so this experience of the arrow of time is very general. And Eddington asked whether it's something special about human consciousness. And what these experiments we did confirmed is that no, it doesn't have to be anything specific about neurological mechanisms or anything like that. Any system which measures intervals of time will have an arrow of time built into it.
Fascinating. And I don't know, but I'm led to believe that we now can say, and perhaps this is research you're referring to, that the arrow of time is necessary to make certain findings in physics correct. So that our intuition that there is an arrow of time, which seems one of the most indisputable aspects of being alive, is confirmed, which is nice to know, by physicists.
Well, I think that's right. The second law of thermodynamics was originally to try and make steam engines work more efficiently. It turns out to be much, much more fundamental than that. And I think there's no prospect of it being overthrown soon or ever.
What do you make of the fascinating observation that life everywhere is trying to buck the second law of thermodynamics by going the other way, entropy being lost rather than increased?
Oh, well, this was articulated by Erwin Schrödinger. It's sometimes known as Schrödinger's paradox. And since we've mentioned Colin Blakemore already, we all live in Northmoor Road, so Colin lives in number 11. And Erwin Schrödinger for a time lived in number 24 Northmoor Road, where he had a cat called Milton. But as far as I know, he never did the Gedanken experiment on Milton. But I think that one's been properly answered. In other words, it's true that if you have a system that's not isolated, that's crucial. Yeah. Then, you know, within that non-isolated system, the entropy can decrease. Yes. But it has to export the same or a greater amount of entropy to the rest of the universe. I think there's a bigger question, though, which is to do with causality. And you know, a lot of people wrestle with causality and determinism, and, you know, did my neurons make me do it, or did I have a genuine choice and a genuine responsibility? I don't know how any of us could live our lives without a sense of responsibility. I'm not quite sure what it would mean to have a human experience if you never felt responsible for anything you'd ever done.
But I know a few people who live like that.
But one of the fundamental questions that may shed light on at least where the problem lies is whether you think that the universe is a closed causal system.
I would intuitively have thought of it as an open system.
Yes, yes.
And it's quite important to differentiate the behaviors of open systems from closed systems, and a lot of philosophical problems are thwarted by people not clearly enough understanding that the system they're looking at is open rather than closed. Anyway,
let's come back to the brain to draw this to a close. We have the wonderful advances in neuroscience, to which, you know, our neighbour like Colin Blakemore has made wonderful contributions. And we also have this to me, very strong sense that whatever free will makes, which can sometimes feel a bit elusive, it's kind of sometimes hard to know what the influences were on decisions and choices that you make. Are there any, and so we've got the brain working as a rather efficient mechanism. Indeed, if it didn't work as an efficient mechanism, we wouldn't be able to implement any of our choices. And at the same time, I think most of us would want to say, well, I am an agent. I can choose good or evil. I can decide how I'm going to behave to some extent. Are there any ways in which the insights you've had on the relative roles of the two hemispheres of the brain shed some sort of light on that without necessarily solving the whole problem?
I think probably rather indirectly, in that one way of getting a handle on different arguments about the nature of consciousness and free will is to think about what the left hemisphere would be seeing and what the right hemisphere would be seeing. And the first part of my new book, The Matter with Things, is devoted to explaining that in every respect that we can assess the veridical or non-veridical nature of perceptions, judgments, understandings in the left hemisphere and in the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is in every case superior. So if we can see that a certain kind of mechanical model for something seems to stem from the left hemisphere, it should alert us to the fact that there may well be something that's being overlooked. So that is a way in which it does bear on such very fundamental problems. I think free will is a complicated one, but it's not helped by many of the most famous experiments, such as the Libet experiments, which are flawed in so many ways, and that nobody now thinks that they demonstrate that there is no free will, or very few people.
And yet it's amazing how the industry of Benjamin Libet's methods continues, doesn't it?
Oh, well, yes. In fact, Libet himself didn't think that he had proved that there was no free will. So,
it would actually be rather surprising if our choices didn't have some sort of brain activity that precedes them, that leads to what.
Well, it depends what you mean by precedes. The whole idea of the experiments was that they do precede, but that doesn't seem to be the case. They're accompanied, these things, they go together. When we think something changes in our brain. When something changes in our brain, we think something. So they are, coming back to the issue of cause and effect, they are like two sides of the same coin in a way. But I don't think any argument suggests that we don't have free will, and it would be a very odd thing if it were the case, as you point out, not just from an intuitive point of view, but it would really stop all discussion about it, because the person who thinks that there is no free will has been determined to think like that, and I have been determined to think differently, and therefore there is really no point in having a discussion.
I hesitate to stop a conversation ever, but Iain, this has been so enriching. I've enjoyed it, and I hope we shall resume often.
Lovely, I hope so too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.